Welcome to the last session of the day.
Yay!
Woo! And you know what they say? They always save the best for last, right?
They do.
So welcome. My name is Kimmeline Dixon. I am Senior Project Director of Cleveland Purpose-Built Communities from Cleveland, Ohio, also known as PBC. We are one of the newest network members and really grateful to be a part of this great body of work as we are working to transform neighborhoods across the nation. I actually represent a partnership between the Cleveland and St. Luke's Foundations, and we serve as the community quarterback in Cleveland, Ohio for this work. Cleveland is unique in that we're working simultaneously in two neighborhoods, one with a strong focus on public housing in terms of transformation, and the second that has similarities to the Grove Park neighborhood that some of you all toured today. Before I get into introducing our great session speakers, I do want to acknowledge my team from Cleveland who traveled down today and joined me in this conference. So if you all can just wave and say hi and thank you for the great work that you're doing and that we have yet to do. And I hope that you are as inspired and fired up as I am.
That's great.
This is actually the second of two sessions led by Prosperity Now. Equitable development and the racial wealth divide is a topic that is close to many of our hearts and is key to our missions in community development. This session will be a workshop that will teach us how to integrate racial economic and wealth equity into program design, development, and implementation. We are lucky to have Lillian Singh, Vice President of Racial Wealth Equity, and Cat Goughnour, Associate Director of Racial Wealth Equity from Prosperity Now, to teach us how to turn racial economic and wealth equity theory into practice. If you want to learn more about their fantastic backgrounds, I encourage you to check out their bios in the conference materials and on the app. Please join me in welcoming Lillian Singh and Cat Goughnour.
I'll start out and then I'll introduce you. Hello, everyone. How are you? Good. I'm Cat Goughnour, as Kimmeline introduced. I am a part of the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative at Prosperity Now. Lillian Singh, our Vice President, will talk a little bit more about the work we do, but we're very grateful for Purpose Built and the invitation to come today and really think about how we operationalize equity. You know, how do we get equitable outcomes? What can we learn from the work that Prosperity Now does across the nation? We're so privileged and blessed to be working with some of the people who are closest to the problem, who have amazing solutions, but often need a little bit of support or visibility, some legitimizing voices that come from a national intermediary able to bring hard data, right, to communities to kind of unearth what's happening and start thinking about the causes and the consequences of racial economic inequality, and how we build solutions through place-based work to give different outcomes for people. I'm going to thank you in advance for bearing with me. I have this boot on, so I'm going to hide back here, but definitely on the mend. Let me see. Sorry, thank you. So, let me see. Is it? Oh, thank you very much. Oh, it's not working. Sorry. Is it on? You'll advance the slides? Okay, great. That would be great. We're ready for the next slide.
Oh, it's off. That's what.
Oh.
There you go.
So as Kimmeline read, and as you all saw in the program, we're really trying to turn a theory into practice. What does it mean to look at data to drive our decision making? Really trying to reallocate resources and power and privilege in support of the people most impacted. We have two kind of guiding documents that undergird some of our work. The first is the Right to Root report. So in my former life before joining Prosperity Now, I did work around anti-gentrification, gentrification mitigation in Portland, Oregon. I think in the year 2015, we were announced by Governing Magazine as one of the most gentrifying places. So really trying to think about how do we stop the displacement of African Americans? How do we engage urban planners and architects, the people holding the money and the power, to really center the people most impacted to drive solutions? We also, And this is available online, but this is one of the documents. And then we also have the African American Financial Capability Initiative, which was a project we did at Prosperity Now in 6 different cities across the country, where we tasked community groups with really creating solutions that would be meaningful to create racial economic equity. Some of the cities created like a community land trust out of Seattle. You all might be familiar with Africatown. Des Moines also created a CDFI. So thinking about structural inequality and how do we create the kind of system, to Brian's point, that's not broken, that actually is designed to create the kind of outcomes we need and that we ensure is doing that work. Many people ask, what is racial equity? And I really liked this definition because it talks about the need to change the structure, the systems, right? Our work is really intentional about not blaming individuals for the outcomes they experience. And by recognizing and valorizing their untapped potential, their assets as community members, we're really able to start creating more equitable outcomes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lillian to talk a little bit about Prosperity Now, the racial wealth divide. And then our goal for today is going to be to have you all dive into doing some workshopping, working with your neighbor next to you. We've provided a little bit of data and a worksheet. Also a document on power, right? Many people are never clear about what power means. So how can we actually leverage something? How do we identify it? And then also a series of questions from this wonderful group called Fake Equity, right? In Seattle, they have this checklist to really check your biases and make sure we're getting the right people at the table. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lillian to give us a little bit of foundation and grounding.
Thank you, Kat. Raise your hand if you know before the conference today, Prosperity Now. Oh, all right. We got some friends in the audience. That's awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to keep this high and tight so that we can get to the work. And okay. So this was actually framed a little bit for us already by our previous speaker. We're so happy. Kat and I were both in tears just about, really understanding that you can't talk about moving forward if we don't have a true understanding of where we've been as a country. So one of the things that we always say is that the foundation of the racialized economic inequality that we see today is actually rooted in the foundation of economic inequality. I'm sorry. Let me do this over. I cannot see the slides. I'm going to just come down. Is that all right?
You can walk around.
I'm just going to come on down. The foundation of racial inequality is racialized economic inequality, and the foundation of economic inequality is wealth inequality. So our previous speaker already went over this, so we won't, thank you. We won't go into it too much more, but I'm going to keep it moving. So our guiding principles. First of all, we never enter a community unless we are invited. Right? So I'm going to say that again. National intermediaries have a bad reputation. They come in, they take resources, they scavenge from the intellectual capital that's on the ground. Like, we know that. Raise your hand if you believe that and you know that that's been some of your experiences sometimes. That ain't nobody's story? Okay, that's great. But one of the things that we understand as a guiding principle for us when we enter communities, right, is that one, we are always invited through some type of project or initiative, and these are our guiding principles. When we work with nonprofit organizations, we're working with about 75 organizations across 15 cities right now. And structural economic inequality, not individual deficiency, is the root of racial income and wealth disparity, okay? So we debunk every single chance we get this idea that if a person do better individually, then they're gonna have a better outcome. We believe that the structure needs to be improved and completely dismantled so that individuals can have better outcomes within that structure. What we also know and believe to be true is that there is disinvestment at every single level. Data tells us this at the individual level, at the community level, at the organizational level, which is why we unapologetically work with organizations led by and serving people of color, because what the data tells us is that people of color, organizations led by people of color disproportionately receive less resources than majority-led organizations, irrespective of what city or ecosystem you're operating in. And the last principle that guide our work is life outcomes are predicted by race, and we want to change that. We need to name it. We need to tell the truth. That was what Byron said to us earlier today. So this is the reality. So overall, what we believe is as national intermediary, what does that mean? We have a 70-person organization. We have a policy team, we have a research team, we have a savings and financial capability team, we have the racial wealth divide team. We are funded by philanthropy. So let's be clear, right? So there's a tension there because we are a national intermediary that's funded by the very sources that fund you all locally, right? And our job, my job as vice president of not just the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative, but as of August 15th, vice president of programs, is to make sure that every single thing that we're doing at the national level is in direct service of organizations on the ground. There is no need for prosperity now if we do not understand that everything we're building should advance the ecosystems in which we're trying to impact. So that's what we do. That's the work that we do. We work with organizations to resource them, validate them, put them in front of power brokers and decision makers. And our goal is, if we do that correctly, if we equip them with the right resources, if we enable them with the right opportunities, that we're going to see different outcomes in the ecosystems led by people of color. 7 core principles that center our work. We have a team who have collectively about 100 years of experience working at the intersection of community, programs, practice, and more importantly, communities of color. The people that are on this team are of and from community. So we have a culturally specific technical assistance approach. We help organizations understand how to actually define financial capability, financial literacy. Is that some terms that you guys use at all? Financial capability, financial behavior, financial literacy, right? But we help our organizations we work with connect that to data and the realities of what's happening on the ground. We also provide flexible funding. We believe that you have to provide flexible funding for innovation and design. We foster communities of practice. Logan, if you was in our previous section, is a part of a community of practice. Even though we know Logan is a superstar, there's 6 other organizations in Wilmington that we are also working with as a community of practice because one organization can't do it. And we encourage leadership development. Thayer, thank you so much for naming earlier in that previous session that you invested in Logan, and a part of our model is to make sure that organizations going through our ecosystem have leadership development training, so then that's never an excuse for why they're not invested in. We also empower direct service providers to have data, policy, and everything else that they need to actually move advocacy on the ground. So who do we work with? We know that there is no silver bullet, hard stop, full stop. Raise your hand if you're in the workforce development space in this room. Early child care development, community development, CDFI. All right, awesome. So we're actually youth programming. There you go. We know that this is actually interconnected. All of these issues are interconnected, and you cannot solve for racial economic inequality if you do not acknowledge how these things must work together. So we work with and we partner with a number of different types of organizations. This is just a high-level map of where we are. Fortunately, because of JP Morgan Chase, Mary, you in the room? No, I was going to shout her out, y'all. She's one of our primary funders. We're going to be able to continue to expand this work and enter more cities in 2020 and 2021. Now, the real presentation, y'all, today is by Cat Goughnour, who is, I will give her a high-level introduction, but she is an equity justice, expert. That's the way I would say it. She's been actually named as a housing expert in the state of Oregon for helping them actually translate equitable designs within that ecosystem. She's also our in-house expert on racial wealth equity. Internally, she leads our entire organization on a path to try to understand how to integrate an equity approach in all of our programs, from affordable housing to our applied research team to our policy and advocacy team. And she's designed the presentation as well as the workshop that we're going to go through today. So without further ado, I'm going to reintroduce Ms. Cat Goughnour.
Oh, thank you, Lillian. Thank you, everyone. So, as you can see, we're busy. I also want to shout out the rest of our team here. We are small but mighty. So what Lillian always said, there are about 5 of us who do this work. We do it with support from other folks in the organization, also with consultants. We really try to bring subject matter experts to all the work that we do. As Brian lifted up, we've been dealing with these racial economic equity issues for a very long time. To Lillian's point, we do need to think about the history of land theft and unpaid labor as the genesis of racial economic inequality. And with that, we need to then start to think about how to help people overcome poverty, multi-generational poverty. Many of our groups really work on two-generation models because we know supporting children is very important, and if you're able to support their families, it's even more successful. So really trying to bring together the best minds, the most wisdom, to focus on these issues and using an approach that really understands structural economic inequality. So this is my attempt to try to map out what we mean when we're talking about structural, institutional, systemic racism, oppression, and the root causes, right? We often are asked, how can you target something that you cannot see, right? So the goal with this is trying to understand what is causing people to exist in the way they are. Is it a criminal justice issue? Is it a housing crisis issue? Does it have to do with property rights? Who has access, who doesn't? And then thinking about the political, economic, and social systems that reinforce what is happening at the institutional level. The structure is really, in my opinion, and please feel free to give feedback or pushback, is around history, policy, and the laws that govern the country. Those are ultimately what need to change. But while we're waiting for that change to happen, people also need to have a wonderful quality of life in this lifetime given to them, right? It's taken 400 years to build the structure we're in. It might take that long or longer, but what we need to do is figure out how to do both things. So we think about it as a programmatic policy hybrid. There must be things that can be done because policy is most often informed by program outcomes. What we don't know, because our policies and laws are facially neutral, but our outcomes are racially predictable, is how to create the kind of system we want and get the outcomes we want. So being able to pilot and then scale is a really great way to have community-led, grassroots-led participation where what is being designed is actually what fits the needs. So when we go into a community, we do bring data, and like I said, you have some in your packet, but we're gonna do a deeper dive. But the biggest challenge I think we have is how to look at problems through a racial and economic lens, and how to not blame the victim and be able to tell a different story, right? The data tells one piece, but we also need an evidence base. Brian Stevenson, amazing. Breaking down, and Richard Rothstein last night, talking about the structures and how those are causing the inequality we see today, even though we know our communities are more educated than they've ever been. Because civil rights did break down some barriers, right? We know Black and Latino women are some of the fastest growing entrepreneurial sector. However, we still know that disparity in income and wealth is concentrated by race, class, and gender. So being able also to look at the ecosystem, to that earlier slide, what institutions are your allies, which are your adversaries, what's working for you, what's working against you, how do you start to shift the power or make different asks of people in those institutions, and who do you need to have at your table? How many of you all were in Logan and Lillian's earlier session? So how to bring people to the table who can help you leverage your social capital is very important. We all come with a level of expertise by virtue of living these conditions, but sometimes we do need a cosigner, a legitimizer, someone who helps us get in the door, someone who helps us to activate our power and not just be a token in the room, right? So being able to kind of think through the frame, thinking then about the analysis and the diagnosis. What is the cause? What is the consequence? So what are we seeing people experiencing? And then to Brian's point, what narrative are we telling ourselves about why that's happening? Do we need to change the way we're thinking about the problem? That's why we do the racial wealth divide profiles. Being able to show the data, but also thinking about migration stories, thinking about the historical process of redlining, how that stripped wealth from communities, right? thinking about those to identify solutions. Are we looking at an economic issue or wealth issue, right? And these are slightly different. One is about what you hold over time minus what you owe, right? That's wealth. But then we have a continuum around poverty, debt, assets, all these different places of intervention. And we like to lift that up because all of our groups do a different kind of work, like we said, but there is always a place for the more groups, the merrier in a process. My crutch is having a life of its own. I hit somebody earlier with it on accident, but, and then the change levers. And Lillian brought this up before. Do we have strong programs that are centered around the needs of our community members? Are we piloting innovative solutions? This is one of the most exciting pieces of the work to me because nonprofits often do their work in a similar way. Over time, it's just the way it goes, especially if funding is dictating how they're doing programming. So being able to create a social innovation, thinking about place-based and population-based strategies gives them a new audience and a new way of talking about their work and a new way of using their own internal data to prove what they're doing is working. Partnerships are then possible because you're able to bring new people to the space. Everybody knows about racial economic inequality and the racial wealth divide these days. So it's much easier to have these conversations than it was even 10 years ago. That bodes very well for the future, but we do need certain rules of engagement and terms to make sure that the communities are the beneficiaries. Philanthropy has an amazing role to play. The private sector partnered with the public sector, being able to really fund at the level communities need is essential. And then policy change, our groups find it almost better to do administrative policy, ways of shifting local budgets, and being able to weigh in through community benefits agreements, or being able to really dictate how policies are implemented, as well as submitting legislative policy. The first one is a little bit of an easier win because it's closer to home, and getting larger operating budgets means that this work can be sustainable. So in your packets, you have this data. I know, how many of you all are from Georgia? Okay, at least it's a few. We just wanted to bring an example of data that we use so that you all can start to see where the hotspots are in data. We always disaggregate by race as much as we can. Some you'll see non-applicable. We are always trying to gather better data, but some communities are very, very small, so they say. We also know that we're actually serving the people, so the people do exist. So it's also an opportunity to put more data in where it's incomplete. But thinking about the ways people are impacted and what those numbers are telling us is really important. We also have added the cost of living index because one of the things we're not thinking about post-recession is, well, I mean, we're probably all thinking about this, but how expensive cities are becoming, especially as revitalization comes, right? It's an unfortunate counterpoint to revitalization. All the amenities become a little bit more expensive. Things are catered and targeted to different communities, so what might have been enough to live on suddenly becomes less optimal. So being able to really peg asks to what the cost is of goods and services, childcare, all the necessary things one needs day to day, we find is very important, especially cities like Seattle, where we do work. The cost of living index there is actually more expensive than New York. So, and the median income for African Americans is $30,000. I think they say it costs about $100,000 a year to have a good quality of life. We're having a very different conversation than just talking about getting people out of poverty, right? We need lots of supports and ways of having collective ownership. That's why they're looking at collective ownership models, because so many people are locked out, they're not able to start participating in building assets. So, to the point of this continuum, poverty, income, assets, wealth, and debt, we know that all of the groups we're working with kind of deal with all these issues. The thing about income that's so important is many nonprofits are eligibility restricted, right, based on 0 to 80% area median income. And the question is, how does a family of 4 earning $40,000 then become wealthy? That's barely enough to cover the basics. So being able to then think about assets acquisition, if it's depreciating assets like a car, how then to leverage some of those things so that you can start amassing wealth over time. Some of the most important data I think we've put out as a team at Prosperity Now is trying to project, based on where we are today in the growth rate of income and wealth, how long it will take for, in this case, Latino and African American communities to catch up with the level of white wealth today. Many people find this story, this historical timeline, really overwhelming, a little bit disheartening, but most of the people we work with feel this is a call to action. And it spurs them to start to think about different ways of dealing with issues that have plagued us for far too long. The thing about wealth is it's very hard to build if you're not earning, unless you inherit, which is always nice. I think somebody said the best way to ensure that you'll be wealthy is be born to the right parents. Would that we could choose. But also, it shouldn't relegate us, right? What the country has done in the past shouldn't then determine how we live our future. So how we earn, what we own, minus what we owe, and we understand debt is disproportionate, right? At this point, people are making up what they're not earning in debt, also trying to leverage around education. The student loan rate is stripping people's assets and their ability to even participate in home ownership, having a family. These are very, these are very heartbreaking outcomes of an economic system that's unjust. So ultimately, we are trying to get to wealth, both for institutions, for community members, and then for cities overall that is not racially predictable. And in thinking about the issue of wealth inequality, I am known as a nerd on my team, definitely. I wanted to know if there's any way to try to quantify structural inequality. There's a lot of work happening, right, around this space as there are conversations about reparations, taking hold of the nation, thinking about what policies could be put into place. But what I think people are also starting to wonder is, what is the amount that is owed? The wealth divide between white people and black people is $150,000 for white people of average wealth. For black people, it's $3,400. We know people work hard. We know people built many things. We also know people are unpaid. So thinking about this, Yes Magazine published something in 2015 that said the value of 40 acres, from 40 acres and a mule, that was promised but never given, was $6.4 trillion. That's what it would be worth in today's dollars. So, but I thought the $6.4 trillion, if we were to divide that by the 44 million people, black people, what would that amount be? And ironically, it's about $150,000. Sometimes you just can't do it better, you know. But then I started to look at unpaid labor. And did any academics start to try to think about what black people would be owed for all of the years of forced labor unpaid? There is an academic at Yale. He said from 1776 to 1865, the time the U.S. was founded, to the end of enslavement, that it would be about $5.4 to $14.2 trillion would be the amount, right? And so I thought, again, what would that look like for each of those 44 million African Americans? It's about another $300,000. And then I thought, what would this $450,000 buy people? It would buy you a house. It would get you an education. You could have a business. And you would have a living wage income with benefits, is about the total amount. That would ensure that people would have a wonderful life and, to your point, be able to pass that on multi-generationally. It's not that much. but it's a lot. So this is research that I'm hoping to publish. Is it the best research ever? No, but I like to try to put parameters on things and think about it in a way that is digestible. When we're throwing out numbers like 17 trillion, all of these things, it does cause an emotional reaction. But if we're actually able to break it down and see what people would have, and look at the data and see what people don't have, we're able then to start thinking about what kind of solutions, what kind of asks, what kind of policies do we need to target to ensure that we're getting to parity. We can't wait 242 years for people to catch up to a level of wealth today. That's not saying that white people wouldn't keep amassing wealth, so the disparity grows. With that, I see your hand. Do we have... We're going to turn over and go into the workshop. So I would love to give you some directions about what we would like you to do. And it's basically walking through this sheet. Try to make things bite-sized, like I said, because it's all really heady. And I'll tell you, I'm from rural Oregon. I was a mature student. I was 30 when I started university, and I was a high school dropout. I was able to go to the London School of Economics and really focus on race, ethnicity, post-colonial studies. First-generation college student, have the debt to prove it. But what I want to know is, how do we make this something that people can do themselves in their communities with each other so that they're able to build power and speak the language of the oppressor to change the outcomes and get them on side as an ally to share privilege and power. So this little sheet asks you to look at the data you have with yourself or your neighbor, to think about a data point that really is striking to you. And I would invite you to think about your own communities as well, right? Think about why you think that's happening. Remember to think about the institutions, the systems, and the structures. I had a political philosophy professor who said, your proximal problem has a distal cause. I was like, what does that mean? He was like, what you're experiencing here, if you try to solve it right here, it's never going to get solved because it comes from somewhere else. And so for me, our problems come from history. Our problems come from law and policy and from neglect of our community and our needs, right? So how do we start to think about what's causing the issue? What evidence do we have? Thank goodness they have all these books here that we can take and be able to quote chapter and verse to whomever needs to hear it about why things are the way they are. People are not lazy. They're not unmotivated. There's a structure in place that was created to create racial economic inequality. In capitalism, that is so important because it is very hard to fully participate if you're not able to ante up, right? You can't even get to the game. So, the game of life. I don't know if it's really a game. Very high stakes if it is. So, the framing, who, what, when, where, why, how. I find that's the easiest way to make a compelling argument, and it doesn't have to be long. That's why the boxes are so small. And then my question is, what solution would you propose? As we've heard, it can be something that's never existed. When I worked on the African American Financial Capability Initiative, we had to try to think about solutions we've never seen. Some of the groups also looked back at historical Black models and said, we're just going to replicate that because for some reason, we no longer own that. Community land trusts was a program that was created by African Americans during civil rights movement for collective land ownership. I think Habitat for Humanity was also a model, the shared equity model that was started. Some of the things that are not serving us are amazing, and we created them. So there's a way to do some kind of cultural reclamation as well. And then what actions are you going to take? How would you implement and operationalize the solution you bring forward?